Thank you everyone for joining Minnesota HIMSS today for our second webinar in our series focused on medical device security from the folks at CynergisTek. Today's topic will focus on building a business case in medical device security. Please check out our first webinar on the medical device security series on our website at mn.himsschapter.org. We will conclude this series with our last webinar scheduled for September 30th. Please be sure to register for that event as well. We will be recording this event and making this available to all of our Minnesota HIMSS members. If you would like to be a speaker or sponsor for a future webinar event, please reach out to us via our website. We will do a Q&A at the end of the session. If you have any questions that you would like to ask our presenters, please type this into the questions section of GoToWebinar. I am pleased to introduce our speakers today, Matt Dimino and Carrie Weisall. Matt is an advocate to help our nation's healthcare and public health sector recognize and prepare for tomorrow's cyber threat landscape. Matt is a medical device security consultant for CynergisTek, a top-ranked cybersecurity firm. He has 13 years in his long career involving roles such as clinical engineer, professor, and researcher and consultant for a nonprofit public health and safety organization. Mr. Dimino holds a bachelor's degree in clinical engineering and an MBA in healthcare, and has earned numerous IT security industry certifications. Motivated by work that makes a difference, Matt is proud to continue research and extend his expertise in the domains of education, medical device cyber threat mitigation, and the implementation of prevent strategies. Carrie Weisall is the Director of Managed Security Services for CynergisTek. She is responsible for vendor security management, management security service, and medical device security. A healthcare veteran with over 20 years of experience in IT leadership, 12 of which have been specifically in security. Prior to joining CynergisTek, Carrie served as the Senior Director of Security for Ascension Information Services. During her time there, she was part of the leadership team that implemented Ascension Security Operations Center, as well as the company's e-forensics security training and awareness, medical device management, and incident response programs. Carrie was also responsible for the Access and Identity Management Program, which provided identity and access services for over 200,000 users across the system. Thank you, Matt and Carrie, for presenting today.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. Matt, if you can take a look at the agenda for us. We're going to go over a few things today, this afternoon for you. So hopefully, if you didn't get to see the first web session, you can go back and look at it. You can see the progression that's happening here as we go through the three. So today what we're going to talk about is a little bit about what's the foreseeable risk for medical devices. Where are we? Where do we see ourselves going? Talk a little bit about what are the common issues in developing a medical device security program versus just buying a tool and having a tool and using it. The third is part of what you want to do as part of your assessment is bring in a tool, but how do you know how to evaluate that vendor? What's the right product for you? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk a little bit about doing a cost analysis for having a medical device program. Everybody asks you for a business case or what's the ROI, so we're going to help you answer some of those questions today. Talk a little bit about what the future developments look like, how we see this moving forward, and how you can take advantage of that now. And then, of course, the usual wrap up and QA. So let's go ahead and get started, Matt. Let's talk about the foreseeable risk. Now, everyone here probably knows that they did actually hack a medical device at Red Hat 3 years ago, but they didn't really get anything. They got to the device. So really, unless your goal of getting into the device is to get grandpa to give you your inheritance early because he's connected to that device, it's probably not the biggest risk at the moment. What really is the risk is multiple events happening at the same time. So if any of you had anything to do with WannaCry at your health system, you'll understand how getting something onto the network that causes so much traffic and so much chatter, the medical devices can't talk. And in that scenario, the whole network was having problems. So not just medical device workstations. So of course, you're going to focus on the workstations first to get all the nurses back up. By the time you get that back up, you've already had to move or defer patients because half of your devices aren't working that you use to treat the patient. So you always want to think of not necessarily what's going to happen if this one little device goes down, but that one little device is on a segment with lots of other devices, and what is the impact? Really think about how that could spread across your health system as you're looking at what your segments are. And then a little bit about the integrity of the medical devices. So you could have someone plant something on a device that sits for weeks. If you're not scanning or you don't have it segmented, you don't know that. If a physician brought in a USB drive that had a virus on it, plugged it in, only looked at the file for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, it's a dormant virus, till somebody comes back in and uses that, you can't really use antivirus on these devices, so you now have a loss of integrity for that medical device, and you don't even know it because you're not looking at what's happening to that device every day. Then we also know that there's some gaps here that we don't really think about and we don't address very well. None of us address very well the gaps that cause risk. So procurement is a big piece here. From the time you purchase that device to the time you get rid of that device, there are a lot of moving parts and pieces. There are updates, there's patches, there's changes to the way you may use that device. But the bigger piece that procurement really opens up for risk is right the second before you put it on your network. If you don't have a standard configuration for that device, and I apologize, we're getting a package and both of my boys need to let me know that. You didn't put a base configuration on that device, so now anything that it came with is on your network. Generic passwords, open ports, open protocols. You probably don't even have any firewall ACL set up to address it. A good example to use for procurement where we really don't see the need for a base configuration, but we really should, are your IV pumps. So you tend to have thousands of infusion pumps, but there's no procurement process for them. Most of the time, IT doesn't even know they exist until they hit your wireless network. So really understanding what you need to do from that device, from the time you take it out of the box to the time you need to wipe it and pass it on to its next lifetime is a big deal. What about what's in your clinical network inventory? Do you know what's in your clinical network inventory? I would gather to say that from a CE standpoint, you probably know the devices that are in your inventory because you've got PM protocols where you've got to service them based on state or city or sometimes county regulations to make sure that they are safe for the patients that are attached to them. But are those folks tracking MAC addresses? Are they tracking IP addresses? Do they know even if that device connects to the network? If there's a cable, obviously they're going to be able to see that, but more and more devices are wireless and they're probably going to have no idea that they're connected to the network. And then really, we know we have a gap in industry training and awareness. There's a gap really just between CE and IT, but from the CE perspective, the whole goal is to keep that machine up, keep it running, and keep the patient that it's connected to safe. They don't really think about the fact that the security on that device could be part of what's causing the risk for the patient. It's never really been part of the equation until the last probably 5 or 6 years. So we need to make sure that that training is starting to catch up, and it's not just you bring on a new CE, he goes through all of the manuals, sits through hours of training on how to service a device. They also need to sit through some training on what's the security risk and what should they be doing help minimize that across your organization. Now we know there's lots of challenges. One we just talked about, the fact that while we want them to have this training, there's not a whole lot out there. There's some, but they're really hard to get to. And they're mostly focused on IT, which most of those concepts are foreign to a clinical engineer. So we need to kind of bridge that gap a little bit. And then really the last one is that there's a lot of specialists out there, but they're really either looking at the technical controls or they're looking at how do I manage my level of risk, but not really putting the two together to make it a common sense plan. I know personally, having to address our cybersecurity plan every year with those lovely folks from Beasley, there's always a question in there about our medical devices and what level of risk are they adding to our environment. In the first few years, we have to admit we were guessing until we got a plan in place. And then once you see the numbers, you wish you could go back to guessing. They were much better when I was estimating them than when I actually saw what they were. All right, next slide, Matt. All right, so let's talk about why it's kind of hard to develop a medical device security program. Next slide. So here are some of the common issues you're going to run into. You're in a healthcare related business. So their whole goal is to treat patients, get them in, get them out, get more patients in. And while these are addressing a risk that could be patient-centric, you really struggle to make that case on the business side that this is a patient-centric issue that we need to deal with. So most of the time, there's not a lot of funding for it. If you don't have funding, you definitely don't have staffing because that's where your funding comes from. The training is difficult at best to get the cross-training that they need. And then really, what does your organizational structure look like? Where do CE and IT security kind of converge? Usually they don't. They're on two separate paths. How do you get your organizational structure to help you make this a priority? And we'll talk about that in a minute, but that is part of the problem. The other thing is we have lots of IT policies and procedures. I'm sure every health system has an overarching IT policy. You've got standards below that. You've got policies, procedures, guidelines. But those are all IT specific. It's very rare that you will see an IT plan that includes medical device security. Now, you might a little bit in the incident response plan. There might be a blurb of, if this is a medical device, call clinical engineering. That's not exactly what you'd call a plan for dealing with it. And then really trying to wrap governance around that. If you don't have policies and procedures, it's kind of hard to have governance oversight for any policies and procedures that you'd like to change and how you get that message out there. And the sponsorship for that is usually fragmented. So you usually either are being sponsored by IT because they're getting hammered for all of these hits on the network and breaches, or it's clinical engineering saying, I want to bring a tool in and it's going to help me with my asset inventory. Oh, and by the way, it might help IT a little bit, so we probably should talk to them. So that sponsorship is a little bit difficult to get and to keep it clearly focused on medical devices. The technical piece, really when we talk about managing this from a network perspective, your everyday network tools are not going to work for medical devices. And in fact, if there are any network guys on here, you'll know that when you run a scan, you get a big old list of devices that it says, do not scan. 90% of those are going to be medical devices. There is a real fear of scanning a medical device live and taking that device down. And it has happened. There are documented cases of that. But I think it's really because we treat them as two separate service lines that we don't really try and figure out how to do that. If you can't scan them, you really can't monitor them. So it's kind of this big gray area. There's IP blocks that you block off from your scanning. You might even note them in the network logs that they're medical devices. You probably don't tell your CMDB that they're medical devices. It's just a big gray area and everybody leaves them alone. But the worst thing about that, since you can't scan and you can't monitor, these are the devices that are probably the oldest in your health system. The ROI for some of these devices is incredible. I mean, we all know if you've ever tried to make a pitch for buying a linear accelerator, you're probably going to start somewhere around $5 million. So they're looking to stretch out that ROI. That also means that that PC that's connected to that linear accelerator is not getting updated. We actually ran into one running NT4 last year. So they're really, really not going to keep replacing it. And the vendors don't really own any of the risk. So there's no reason for them to go back and apply security patches or upgrade the operating system because nobody's pushing them. If you have a breach through that device, it's your health system and you own the risk. The vendor doesn't. So the pressure has to come from us to the vendor saying, we can't leave this on our network, or we're going to have to totally isolate this from our network because we can't get it updated. The vendors are a big problem. They all have their own choice of remote access controls. If you have GE or Siemens at your site, you know that it's usually in the contract that they use their own proprietary remote access control. That is changing. Some of the larger health systems, Ascension being one, HCA being the other, are also starting to say, you know what, we have our own tools. We use SecureLink or whichever we use for remote access control, and we want you to figure out how to use our tool. The biggest reason for that is, I know most of you listening to this have had something crash on your floor. You know somebody was in the night before, but you don't have any logs. You can just see that they came into the network. They're swearing they didn't make any changes, but now all of a sudden everything crashed. If you're forcing them to go through something like SecureLink, that is screen by screen tracking. It also limits their ability to have access by ID. When you log into a device like SecureLink, that box passes you through to the device you're trying to get to. There are no IDs and passwords exchanged. So it just really kind of puts some security back into the remote access control, and also gives you a little leverage to say, so it really wasn't you that changed 4 lines of code at 3 a.m. and now it hasn't worked since 3:30 a.m. So my background is security. I'm a trust but verify kind of person. So I'm a big fan of remote access controls that give me the control over who's coming in. And then last is physical security. So we all know that we have those vendors who walk right past security. They may have known the guard, same guy supporting your devices for cardiac for, 10 years. Nobody questions him. He walks in, walks out. Nobody asks a question. You also have other people who are in visiting a patient. While most of them aren't really nefarious, just think about if you have a tap and go environment, you could drop your badge, he could pick it up, he can make any changes he wants to the medical record. Now he's logged in as you, if he got lucky enough to pick up a doctor's badge. But there's also the physical exposure. So that device is physically in a room with a patient and it's not monitored. The only people in there are the patient and the visitor. If the patient doesn't happen to be conscious, again, we might be getting that inheritance a little earlier than we were looking to. All right, Matt, next slide. All right. So one thing that you really need to do, and I'm sure as you've gone through any programs, whether it's medical device or not, is you have to know who your stakeholders are. You have to start by addressing them. Really, you've got to get buy-in from multiple parties, but the first one is really from your clinical staff. What is the risk that's being brought into the environment? How can you show them that these devices are causing risk with your environment? How do you explain to them what the integrity is of a medical device? You really can do that in a couple ways. You could do a BIA on a certain set of systems. If you were going to do that, might I suggest your ultrasound or your anesthesia? Yes, those are usually our biggest culprits of having multiple vulnerabilities. And then really, what are the metrics that you could help them improve to make it seem better for them? So utilization is an easy one for that. If you can show them where their devices are today and how they're using them versus clinical engineering always getting nurses screaming, I don't have enough infusion pumps. Well, they do, because they're hiding them in the closet, and they want to make sure when they come back on midnight that someone hasn't stolen all the infusion pumps, or even the workstations. The workstations get hidden. I do have an ED nurse as a daughter, so I'm familiar with the tactics. But if you could show someone what the actual utilization is, if the hospital saying, we need to buy 500 more infusion pumps, everyone's complaining we don't have them. Imagine the power of you being able to get a report off of a scanning tool and say, well, really? I can see that these infusion pumps haven't moved in 4 days, but this is a floor that's complaining they don't have enough infusion pumps. Or we have a floor that has 14 infusion pumps and they statistically use 8 in any given day. So it's really powerful metrics and making sure that you can present your case as an entire case. Then you want to make sure that you involve all the parties. That's pretty much a no-brainer. You know who they are. Your CISO is probably going to be your best friend through this process, because he is the one who is taking hit after hit for all of this stuff being on his network and being unsecured on the network. Making sure that biomed is part of that process, obviously that's a no-brainer. The piece between IT and biomed, where that starts to get fuzzy, and the reason you want to involve them early is there is still a significant amount of fear from the clinical engineering side that all of a sudden we're going to say we have all these risks and now they need 30 more people. They can't get their normal work done. They don't even want to look at this because they think we're going to dump a bunch of work on them. That's not typically the case. The case usually ends up somewhere around 90-10, 90 being IT, 10 being biomed. So it's really getting those folks comfortable, getting them to understand that what you're trying to do is help them, and then get them on board. Now the vendors, you're going to ask 2 questions. You're going to ask IT, have they talked to any vendors? Have they done any POCs? Did they like anybody? For your biomed folks, you're going to ask them the same thing. You know, have you been talking to your CMMS people? Have they recommended anybody? Have you gone out and looked at a proof of concept here to try and increase your inventory electronically? Those are going to be a lot of buzzwords that are going to help you get some buy-in. And then lastly, you obviously need to have a plan. What are the objectives? What are you trying to do? Well, what you're trying to do is make your network more secure and to secure the medical devices. But what you're also trying to do is make your environment more safe and more stable for patient care. The more that you can eliminate a vulnerability and eliminate the risk of a device going down mid-procedure, the better it is for the patient. So you always want to have that up front in the objective. Talk about what the timelines are. This is not a 2-month process. This is a 6 to 9 month process. Depending on how convoluted the org is, it could be a year process to just make sure that you have everything in place and you do this step by step. And then lastly, you always want a RACI. Who's going to do what, who owns what, and where are you going to go forward with the program? Matt? Okay. This slide, we're just going to talk very briefly about it. We already talked about who the stakeholders are. You know these people. You guys are working with these people. If you're on this call, you're probably one of the people in one of the 4 squares. So just making sure that everybody understands that this is not an IT problem by itself. It is not a CE problem by itself. Clinical is going to think it's not their problem at all, and we need to figure it out for them. They're kind of right, but you need their buy-in because they're the ones that control most of the money and where it goes for the health system. So just making sure that you've got all 4 pieces in there as you start going forward will help you be a lot more successful. Next slide. Now, this is all about building the opportunity to bring a program on. And you're going to start asking these questions as you go down this road. So really understanding what's the opportunity to put a program in place versus just taking a tool, throwing it in there, and getting yourself some data. So you're going to ask yourself, do you already have a process, or do you have a resource to manage medical device security? Do you know what your current security posture is on medical devices? And I would also in here add, do you know what your current security posture is in general? Are you a medium to high, low to medium, or high? What is your risk tolerance in connection with where your posture is? So your tolerance may be medium to low because you really don't have the budget if you have a breach. But your posture could be high and critical, and now you've got to figure out how to get those two to kind of meld a little bit better by putting some security devices in place. Do you have your policies and procedures? I'm going to say 90% do not. They have all kinds of stuff on the CE side, MBS2s, MEMPs, but there are not a lot of IT level policies around medical device security. Do you plan to implement a product as part of your control? Obviously, the answer to this is yes, because if you don't have a product that's doing any kind of passive scanning, you are going to end up having problems with being successful here. You can't scan them with your traditional tools. You do need help. And then lastly, what do you have a defined goal and expectation? So what I would say here is start small. I would say your goal is to have 20% of your medical devices more secure within 1 year. And I'll tell you what, if you start with your infusion pumps, you're going to get over 20% on the first swipe. But you have to have a goal. And it can't be, we're going to be 100% secure in a year. It's just not going to happen. You're going to have to take remediation steps to make that happen. So be realistic about what you think you can do and what resources you have to do it with. Next slide. Okay. So this part, we're just going to wrap this up a little. We've talked about every piece of this. How do you justify doing a program versus a tool? Well, it's really easy. You've already talked about what your scope is. You already know what the purpose is, why you're doing that. You've already set goals because you've got a plan. When you look at a solution, the only two options are manual versus automated. And in today's world, manual is not going to work. What are the costs that are involved? What is this overall level of effort? Will I need to add FTEs? Will I need to add a tool? The piece of focus here on the cost is that if you add a tool, you will definitely lessen the number of FTEs that you need to add, just because you're not going out and manually tracking down these devices. And then make sure that you're stressing the benefits, that you are going to help reduce the threat landscape of the entire organization by addressing this block of devices, making sure that they understand that it's truly creating a safer environment for your patients. And it's giving you, I won't say a totally holistic view of security, but it is a more holistic view, and that you're not ignoring these devices from the IT side because you can't scan them, so they can't be a problem. And then making sure, again, as I said previously, what's your execution and your timeline? Make sure you have a roadmap. Make sure that those roadmaps have actual set timelines that you can do. Don't start chunking off big pieces and then end up setting yourself up for failure. Make sure that your timelines and your milestones are realistic, and you'll be successful. And now to talk a little bit more about that product and vendor evaluation piece that I just talked to, I'm going to turn it back over to Matt.
All right, thank you. So yeah, Carrie hit some of the justification pieces and a lot of why we're here and why we're having some discussions. But what really pulls this together is having a product to help you. It's really difficult to do this on its own. It's difficult and challenging per se to do this in a manual process. So there are numerous tools out there to help you, to help your organization, to help multiple stakeholders get a better grasp of this and to work more efficiently and effectively. So one of those things is a passive scanning solution, a passive scanning tool on the network, and we'll cover a little more about that. But for the most part, if we look down here at the bottom left, we're talking about a charter, right? Carrie mentioned that briefly, but we want clearly defined and identified roles. Who's going to do what? You know, when we bring this together and we want to create a security program, and we've got biomed and CE and IT and IS and all these different groups, it's kind of everyone's looking at each other like, I don't know, what do you want me to do? So having that charter and bringing some key elements to the table and having that conversation is really paramount. I mean, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, that if everyone gets in there together, kind of define what we want to do and why we want to do it, and then you have sponsorship to help, right? Your CISO or whomever who's at that leadership role to kind of create the collaboration, because those individuals really love that aspect of it, right? Their involvement may be little, but they want to see the different parties interact together and engage. And again, all stakeholder input. So one thing or another is everyone's got a little bit difference of opinion. Whether it's this group or that group, they might have certain needs and wants and desires. And you also need to realize that the different, I'll call it allies, right, within the organization. So CE is very, very close to clinical, right? They often support clinical in a face-to-face manner. Not to say that IT or IS doesn't, but it's more of a boots on the ground role in biomed. So they have that a lot of weight with clinical staff. So understanding what clinical staff may want or can't or doesn't want, and vice versa, you know, so getting information from all these different parties can help kind of narrow down the process a little bit. And in your product evaluation process, you want to look at value proposition. You know, what's the evaluation criteria? What kind of scorecard are you going to put together, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. Market competitor and market stance. You know, there's numerous vendors out there now, and there's some real powerful leaders, right? But if you're a small organization, you're a 100-bed facility or you're a 500-bed facility, there's different products out there for you. You know, you might have certain goals and attributes that you want to collect or use, and it's great. So maybe there's a different product that will work for you better, right? Same thing, your infrastructure may not be able to handle some of what we see with the integrations and the additional pieces and all the fun stuff. So if you don't have that ability and you don't really necessarily foresee the infrastructure changing much over the years, there might be a lesser expensive or lesser attribute or characteristic type tool that's beneficial for you. And again, we want to satisfy everyone's requirements, right? So creating a balanced scorecard, which we'll cover, will help everyone kind of become happy with whatever resolution or product you end up with. That way everyone can work within and utilize the tool. Finance is another aspect of this, cost centers and new offerings. Who's paying for it, right? You know, is biomed buying this? Is IT or IS buying this? It really varies. So it's almost a 50-50 between the network team or IS team and then biomed and CE. So more and more biomeds and CE departments are buying these products with a particular need or desire, and sometimes they may not include the other groups to get their buy-in, right? So they might purchase a particular product that's of interest to them because of the attributes it provides for medical devices, but it may not integrate well with the other tools that the network team already has, where there's a better product for that. So looking at, again, who's paying for that, who's paying for maybe if there's integrations, if there's add-ons, additional expenses, contracts, things like that. Timing, right? So you have resources and alignment. You know, there's nothing worse than getting all excited about a product or a solution and getting your charter together, and then no one's got the time for it. You got other projects, and I think it's a little late in the game to start delaying something like medical device security. Sure, you may not have the ability to get a tool in right away, but it's pretty straightforward. I mean, these are plug and play boxes. I hate to say it, but they're very easily configured, and it's just a few phone calls between a couple of team members, and this product ships to you, and you find space for it on a span port or wherever it may be in your data center, and it just takes a couple of weeks of alignment and getting it up and running properly. So yes, there's there's other attributes and aspects to a medical device program, but one of the initial phases in getting maybe a tool in to help you and assist you, the timing is relatively straightforward. But as Carrie mentioned, this is a pretty long process, 6, 9, maybe 12 months, depending upon your size. So being able to identify your timelines and make milestones is going to be advantageous. And management, who's going to own what? What piece of this puzzle gets, what individual or what group gets this or that? That's a challenge. I've seen it in numerous organizations where there may not be a whole lot of ownership over one piece or another. And like Carrie mentioned, it looks like biomed's going to get dumped on with a whole bunch of work, and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. And I'll talk about the embedded process here to help with that, but delegation, sometimes you don't really want to point the finger at the other group, right? Well, I think this is your responsibility versus ours. Well, we don't need to go down that road. If you have your charter and you have your committee together, it can be an open discussion of, here, we can perform this piece. Can you perform the other half? Here's what we're capable of. Here's the data or the flows that we have. What do you have? And find a way to work together in that process. And then accountability, who's accountable for what? And so that's a key piece to the whole product and program evaluation process. So there's some real primary evaluation criteria when you're looking at some different vendors. And there's been several vendors over the market over the last 3 to 5 years. And as one of the things we want to look at is company background. What is their stance? Where are they? Where are their CEOs from? What does their board look like? Do you want to be comfortable with that organization, especially if you're going to sign maybe a 3-year deal with a tool vendor, understanding that they're financially secure or they're not. So knowing what that background looks like, and if they're all pretty much startups at this point. But they're working, and a lot of them are getting a lot of traction. Their asset management capabilities, what does that look like, right? So what can they collect? What can they not collect? What kind of CIs or what kind of attributes are provided? Where does it come from? How challenging is it and how granular is it, right? So you want to make sure that it provides a lot of good asset management information. Same thing with product details. So product details is critical in knowing what the offerings are. What's within the product? Who does it tailor to? There's a lot of, again, products out there where it may tailor a little more to the IS or network operations team versus biomed, and vice versa. There might be a product out there that does really well on the biomed side, but maybe not so well on the other side. So you need to know what those product details are and how they're going to fit within your organization. And then vulnerability management is pretty critical. So a lot of these products help with the vulnerability management process. And it's not just medical devices, it's IoT, it's IS and IT devices, your servers, your infrastructure, pretty much everything that's dangling and hanging and connected to your network may have some sort of vulnerability. And how do you manage that? And I know right now there's other tools for the IT systems and whatnot, but when it comes to the medical devices and IoT, what are we looking at and where does that come from? So in a normal process, that's a boots on the ground kind of manual process of going and looking at that information, right? You might have something that comes in, and do you have active vulnerabilities on this? And it's typically a biomed function at this point. If you're going to start your medical device security program, is you might have to contact the vendor. You might have to scour through the databases and find out, does it reference? Well, a lot of these new products does that for you, right? They might collect threat intel, they might collect this data and be able to provide you some metrics or be able to provide you some information to really narrow this down for you, right? So you might have a specific vulnerability that came out yesterday or today, and they will actually look at your inventory and cross-reference it for you. So the ability to have, an individual just kind of monitor that piece of it reduces a lot of time and creates efficiency rather than, the biomed team kind of looking manually at, does this fit? Does this really work? Is this profiled? So again, when you have maybe a CT scanner or MRI device, and a new vulnerability might be impacted by it, again, these tools often will cross-reference that for you. Security management. So, does the vendor, does the product allow for antivirus can it see antivirus? Can it see certain security pieces? Can it see those attributes that can help you make decisions, right? So IT and IS may not have any idea what medical devices may have antivirus or anti-malware on it, and maybe biomed does or doesn't know because, again, if it's a vendor managed product. But some of these things can can identify that. It can see the east and west, north and south traffic as these products are talking home or getting new information and downloading and updating. So being able to see some of that data. Reporting and alerting is, in my opinion, one of the most critical. So you can get a lot of good details, right? These things are just data warehouses. It's big data. And it's really what they do with the data and what's most important to you is where you're going to find a lot of value in this piece of it. So being able to run reports is key. So when you have some reporting, what do you want to see? What is most important to you? Do you want to see all your assets that have certain vulnerabilities? Do you want to see all your assets that may have certain risk scores? Do you want to see all your assets that are communicating outside of the organization? Those kinds of reportings and metrics are key. So do you have the granularity to modify that? Are you stuck with these pretty reports that are just graphic that really aren't good for the technical people, but maybe are better for the charter or your sponsor? So it may not make sense to have these pretty graphs and charts when really you want raw data. And some of these vendors do really well with providing you real hardcore raw data to where you can manage your own metrics. You can kind of look at some of those key elements. And then maybe clinical support requirements. So with clinical support requirements, you're kind of looking at where's the data? What kind of information does it provide from a nursing standpoint, right? What are the utilization metrics? Is this device used 100% of the time, 24/7? Where does it reside? What kind of care unit is it or may it be in? It's almost its location. So there might be some clinical support requirements that are associated with your evaluation. And then platform security, management, and administration. So the product itself, what kind of security does it have embedded in it? Do you offer more granular permissions, right? So can you break down users and groups and roles? Are you able to look at that information? Do you have a central management point? And maybe even is the product on-prem or is it out in the cloud somewhere? So depending upon your security requirements in your organization and what you really want to do with these products, that may be of consideration and questions. So for the sake of no bias here, we've kind of covered out the vendors, but across the top in the different colored rows here, or columns, we have our different vendors. And what this is just performing some basic research on your vendors. And what you want to know is, what are your technical capabilities? What's your delivery time, your financial status? So you're really scoring these vendors to help really narrow them down, because there are several out there. So if money's no object or something like that, and you're really concerned more about certain attributes, you can really narrow this down to get a better understanding of what's going to fit your organization. And so lots of these vendors often came up around the same time. So some are, again, 2 to about 5 years old. So from a timing standpoint, they're really close in time, but their technical capabilities, and then again, quality of data. So another really critical asset or attribute is that quality of data. And one of the things you can do with a lot of these vendors is, when we get to more discussions on this and we may narrow these vendors or tools down, you might actually just do a proof of concept. Look at the data, right? So you bring them in for 30 days, you bring them in for 60 days. What does that data look like in comparison to what you already know or already have? Do you have a vendor telling you you have 60 ventilators when in fact you only have 20? That right there may nix a vendor from pursuing any further actions with them, because, well, you're not confident in what they do offer you. Okay, so use cases or what we would call some scoring considerations. And what I really like about this is the ability to map this to the NIST cybersecurity framework. So a lot of healthcare organizations are moving to the NIST cybersecurity framework. Some haven't. If you haven't, this is definitely should be a high priority on your list of, here's our opportunity to migrate our medical device security program and map it directly to the NIST CSF. And so we know that NIST has these different categories to help you with actions. And so when you kind of break this down, you can ask yourself, here's my categories, and it maps back to NIST, and here's a description, here's what the capabilities are. So looking at maybe like the first one is the identification, and the description is technology solution will discover all connected medical devices on the network. And then, what are the capabilities? What are the extension really of that? So it can uniquely identify the devices, it can find some standard attributes. Oh, hey, it can actually get very granular. So some of the products are very, very good at getting so granular that it'll give you the actual application version of a device. So you might have an operating, your kernel, you have an operating system, and then you have an application sitting on top of that. So if that's important to you and a device can see all three of those elements, you have this kernel and that might be of utmost importance. And so you can map this back to NIST, and then we can score it in that manner. Same thing with risk assessments. Can the technology or the solution really help you classify security risk? And as far as I know, all the products do, but they use different algorithms. They use different key pieces. And some can be modified. So some can be tailored to what you feel fits your organization. So whether you want to weigh more risk on the network portion or you want to weigh more risk on the clinical aspect of things, that's really feasible. And then others have real strong algorithms that introduce with impact to your business, right? It has the ability to look at, well, you only have 2 CT scanners. So it uses part of that, knowing that you have 2 CT scanners, they're used 90% of the time. So it knows what the business impact is. It knows what that clinical factor is. It knows it's a CT scanner, so it knows that it's $1 million plus. So it knows that that dollar amount component is extremely high. And then it knows that it transmits PHI. It can see that information. It doesn't see the PHI directly, but it sees the attributes, the identifiers that are associated with it. So it's able to indicate and provide a risk score for you. So a lot of organizations at some point might have performed their own risk assessment. They've got their own risk calculations, and that's awesome. But if you don't, a lot of the tools provide that for you. So, take it as you will. Some are, again, very different than others, but that's a key element that should be weighted and assessed. And due to time, don't want to run through each complete element, but these are some of the categories that you would want to really identify and look at. And so everything from policy management to support and device utilization, these vendors offer this within your medical devices, within your IoT, and even within your normal IT assets. So some success criteria. So this is an easy way, well, it's not really easy, but there's multiple criteria descriptions, and I just kind of cut this off to keep it straightforward and to the point. But you have a criteria category, right? What is the product's functions and capabilities? And then we break down the description to, inventory, security, protection, and there's a whole bunch of other elements that you can add in here that are color coded, and then you'll see why here in just a moment. But you'll break it down to, a weight or what's the importance to you and your committee or your organization. And right, you want to discover all connected medical devices on the network. So, well, that's a 10. It could be a 5. It could be a 6. It's really whatever, again, you all choose as you're trying to weight the differences between these products. And then you roll through and, can you provide flow analytics for your devices? So looking at the yellow, the security there is what I like to call the flow genomes. Can these products show you who, what, when, where, and why? Is it inbound, outbound communication? What other devices is one device communicating with? Where is it going? All those factors. And then what does that behavior look like? And can you actually process that behavior for me? You can tell me that it's X amount of megs going out here and X amount of megs going there. And then you can, see that that's an anomaly. That's not supposed to happen, or that is supposed to happen. And some other communication isn't supposed to happen. So the ability to look at those analytics can be really critical, especially as you might build on with tools and you might build on with other network tools that are in your data center. But this is, again, a way to just kind of categorize and create some importance factors for you. So then you can kind of put it all together to create a score metric. And this is a little bit more of an addition to it. So looking at the vendor company itself, the service and support of the company, and like the company itself, again, have they been in business for 5 or 6 years? Have they been in business for 3 years? What's their support model? Do they offer 24/7 support? Are they willing to ship a new box if it breaks? Those kinds of things. What kind of agreements are you in? And that's part of a rating scale as well. So including some of that information, and a little bit of this is redundant here with some of the rating descriptors, but looking at how it would implement and work within your infrastructure, giving it a score, and moving on to the end here. So at some point, you'll have a final scorecard, and it's cross-referenced to the descriptor or description of criteria. So we have our rating factors, right? Functionality, technology solution, cost and support, and there's others. I just, again, cut this a little short so it'll fit on the screen here for you. But then we have the description of criteria. So the inventory, security, protection, utilization, and all the others that I didn't cover. But these are what's most important to you. These are some things that we've put together in the past, but everyone's going to have the different descriptions for what they need. And final score, right? So boiling down from vendor 1 to vendor 2, you can see the bottom here in the grand total, 64.56 versus 62.24. So really, in the end, the vendor wins is vendor 1. And that was an easy way to try and please everyone. Everyone got a little bit of what they want. They got to provide their input, and now we know where we're going to go from here. Because it has happened, it does happen, where again, a group or an entity within your organization decides they want to buy something without input from others, and someone ends up unhappy. Or again, we don't end up collaborating, which really is the last thing you want to happen. So a quick breakdown on the cost analysis here. And what I'm going back to is the whole medical device security program as a whole. You have a manual process and you have an automated process. And the manual process, Carrie hit really well on this already. You have people, you have FTEs, you lack and you don't have training and awareness. So you have to train and make everyone aware. The time and resources. So you have level of effort and you have to do manual research. And we discussed that. You have to go out and look at MDS2s. You have to go look for vulnerabilities. You have to look for anomalies. It is a very, very time consuming process. It's as stated, boots on the ground. It's a game plan with the whole group or whole biomed department or the charter all going and performing some of these actions. The processes and analytics is challenging. Collecting, again, the vulnerability information, those MDS2s, understanding your impact, looking at the analysis of that, right? Weighing exactly what I talked about with what some of the tools already do for you. Business impact analysis based on a particular asset. And then the procedures, risk profiling calculations. Some of you have it, some of you don't. So if you have your own method of calculating risk, great. If you don't, the automated processes can do that for you. Remediation, that's a whole nother challenge in itself is, all right, once you find the data, once you find the information you have, now you need to remediate and you want to remediate. How do you go about by that? So over here on the right, the automated process is more or less, as mentioned, as we've been discussing, is using a passive scanning tool to help you accomplish your goal. This tool is not all in one. It doesn't do everything for you, right? It's a matter of, again, getting together with your charter, getting together with your different stakeholders to create your program. And this tool is more of what we call the technical aspect of it. And when we get to our third session at the end of the month, we'll talk more about the non-technical, the administrative or managerial pieces of it. But for again, the automated allows you to reduce your time. The level of effort is a little diminished because you don't have as many boots on the ground. You don't have as much research you have to do. So you can almost look at applying 1 or 2 or a small team of FTEs to analyze the data that's brought in by the tool. Again, a lot of the tools are analyzing the data for you, so it's just someone to really decipher it. Automated threat intel, that's a great aspect to have, is where you just have to, again, decipher what intel is coming in through the tool. The integrations, or what we call embedded efforts. So the integrations kind of help work with the other tools your NOC team already has, and then it allows you to start to embed some of the efforts we've been talking about into routine daily activities. And processes and analytics, again, a lot of the tools have MDS2 repositories built in. They have that vulnerability information in there. They kind of give you that impact analysis, some do. And then rolling into procedures, we've mentioned they do the risk profiling for you, giving you a risk score or a risk rating. And some of them even give you remediation recommendations, right? So here's how you get rid of this vulnerability, or here's how you remediate this vulnerability. Here's what we suggest. We might offer ACL information. We might offer that information with your integrations. And real quickly, some of the manually managing the medical device security program. Again, a lot of it is biomed, IT, and IS. And so you're going to look at everything we've already talked about, collecting medical device attributes and parameters. Without a tool, doing this manually is a boots on the ground. Hey, this is biomed. I have an EKG device. I have this device. I have this device. And here's the MAC address. Can you help me get the information from it? Can you help me do this? And off you go. And then you have to manually put it into the CMMS and manually document this. And you can really, like I said, embed this into the routine practices, right? Biomed can do this through preventative maintenance. They can do this on corrective action orders. They can do this throughout the day, throughout the period, throughout the time as a team effort, but it's still a lot of time and effort. And it's almost impossible to calculate. Like you can take a group of 15, put it as 15% of their daily time and try to come up with an actual cost, but it's too challenging. It's not really practical. But again, here with the tasks, you have all that, everything from remediating to evaluating and security capabilities, performing the risk assessments. And then automatically doing it, it's still a group, it's still a group effort, but you have an interface to give you that information. You have the ability of a tool to tell you the information here. I've done the work for you. You just need to go do something with the information I provide you. So it really reduces that level of effort with too many people and too convoluted of a mess of this group is going to do this, and it takes all their 15 biominutes to go do that. Where now if you have a single or small team of resources to manage the tool, you're better off being able to work with your tasks and completing your tasks. This level of effort is really based on, I would say, a 450 bed hospital. And what we've been able to do is calculate the difference here with what it would take to create a whole MDS security program. So really looking at the amount of hours, you have biomed around 830, your network team around 340, your security team around 810, and then you've got your project management and your executive sponsor. So this is almost, if you look at it from a 12-month plan or a 12-month plan, and then you're trying to look at your network segmentation piece, your patch management, your firewall updates, policy refinement, your committee, charter, all that stuff is kind of in this level of effort. And this is kind of what we would look at as, this is what it would take to probably get a well-rounded medical device security program, not just a tool, but a complete program with building policies, building your administrative policies, asset updates, things like that. Okay, and I'll just burn through this real quick. This is our last slide here, is a future developments. So we talked about the passive scanning solution probably being that middle piece, and then all the fun stuff that comes along with it, whether you want to be able to generate tickets, you want to implement specific things in your firewalls, your CMMS, your vulnerability management program or platform, all that stuff. So definitely up for discussion later, but these are the actual, a lot of the vendors offer these types of integrations through an API that are probably pre-built or could be custom built. Okay, and the use cases kind of roll with that, right? So utilization tracking for capital planning. You can easily, through this solutions, be able to look at those metrics and then be able to, as Carrie mentioned, nope, you don't need any more infusion pumps. You're good. You've got 1,000 of them. You're only utilizing at 50%. I don't think so. The integrations, creating zones, creating VLANs, creating ACLs and whatnot. And again, the CMMS integration for bidirectional flow of data, creating tickets, asset updates, things like that. Okay, so my apologies on us taking all the way up to the last couple minutes. But Rebecca, do we have any questions that need to be answered here?
We don't at the moment, but if there is a question or two, please feel free to type that into the questions section. We can see if we can answer those in the last minute here.
Sure.
And while we're seeing if there's any questions and stuff, thank you, Matt and Carrie, for taking the time to present. Again, we have the first session recorded out on our website. We'll have this session recorded, and then please stay tuned for our last session, which will happen on September 30th. So at this point, it doesn't appear that there is any questions. There is some questions about making the slides available. At this point, we do plan to have the recording. We can check and ensure with CynergisTek that we're able to share the slides as well. But thank you again, Matt and Carrie, for presenting, and we look forward to connecting with you again on September 30th.
Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.